Hi there, my name's Ewan Nicholson. Welcome to my channel, Remembering Love. Today, it's a little bit of an informal video. I'm just wanting to kind of just shoot some things off the top of my head a little bit. I don't have too much prepared, but really what I wanted to look at is the subject of healing childhood trauma, CPTSD, and the role humility has in that. And I think it's something really worth exploring because to me, humility is a virtue or an attribute that I think can play a central role in our healing process. But at the same time, it feels like it's kind of left out a little bit. I mean, I don't read a lot about humility in what I read when it comes to healing childhood trauma. And I wonder why. Like, why is that? Like, why is that sort of not really part of our healing journey, even though for me, it is a really important part of that healing journey. So in this video, I'd like to discuss, what are some of the cultural influences of that? What's the role in language when it comes to healing our trauma? Why I can also understand the word humility and its proximity to the word humiliation is kind of why it's a little bit tricky when you get into the field of healing trauma. And I'd like to lastly just share with you why humility is important to me and why I feel like it's something that is very central to my healing process. And look, I'm not here to give a sermon on the virtues of humility and tell you all how you should all be more humble as I hop on my YouTube channel and espouse that. I mean, who am I to talk about humility? I mean, okay, I did win Time's Most Humblest Man of the Year in 2020. You might have seen the magazine. Out of 100 esteemed humble people, they voted me number one. So what can I say? I'm probably the most humble man in the world, but that aside, I won't mention that. Whoops, I did. But that aside, who am I to talk about humility? I guess that's who I am.
You're not known to be a humble man, but I wonder.
I think I am actually humble. I think I'm much more humble than you would understand.
Yeah. But funny jokes aside, or not so funny jokes aside, this isn't a sermon on humility. It's more of an exploration of this theme of humility and its role in healing childhood trauma. So to do that, I think it's worth looking, I think it's worth understanding that when we're on this healing journey, when we're healing and working on reconciling and dealing with our CPTSD or childhood trauma, the language we're given in our culture frames how we understand what we experience. And if you read literature in the last 5 years or 10 years regarding childhood trauma, it's very different to the literature written in the 1980s. It's then very different to what's written in the 1950s. So language evolves, understandings evolve, and what those understandings and language gives us is a framing of how we see ourselves, how we see society, and how we see others. And I think a really sort of straightforward example of that is the treatment of alcoholism. 100 years ago, alcoholism was framed as a moral failing, that if you were addicted to alcohol, you had basically weak moral character, and the whole idea to get over alcoholism was just to kind of toughen up and not be so immoral. And then AA came along, and that was a sort of a revolutionary idea, was to understand alcoholism through the frame of a disease. That this wasn't a moral failing, rather it was like a disease of the body, and the only way to cure this disease was through abstinence and through the 12 steps. And that was quite a revolutionary framing or paradigm shift in the treatment of alcoholism. And then the last 20 years, a trauma-informed understanding has also then informed our framing of alcoholism, that it isn't just a disease, it also can be a disease primed by and set up from childhood trauma. So as understandings evolve, languages evolved, and the framing of how one sees oneself today with alcoholism is different to how one would have experienced that 100 years ago. So the culture we live in and the language our culture uses to understand ourselves and society really does affect what we're allowed to think and the framing and how we're allowed to think. And when I look at today's culture and we examine today's culture, it's impossible to say those cultural messages or that the media and society and economy we live in doesn't impact how we think of trauma. I think that's just not real, or I just don't think that's true, because this is the sea we're swimming in. This is the world we live in, and it's this world that gives us a language to understand and be aware of what's going on inside ourselves. So the question is, what is our culture when it comes to understanding of oneself? And the reality is we live in a consumer culture, we live in a capitalist culture economically, we live in a culture where there is a very strong emphasis on individualism and self-importance. We reward attributes of success we reward status, we definitely look up to wealth and power. And, you know, you'd say social media probably has magnified that. I don't think this is a new thing. I mean, I think these processes have been in society for a long time. But I think in particularly over the last 20 years, 10 years, these have been amplified. So if you look at Instagram, TikTok, particularly in youth culture, flex, being seen, showing off, you know, the kind of narcissistic worship of self is, you know, I think has become more dominant, not less dominant. And that focus on individualism and the focus on individual happiness and individual rights and individuals, you know, thoughts and feelings being the primary sort of sense of everything is something we are swimming in. It is a cultural phenomena that we exist within. And the movement away from civic duty, the movement away from solidarity, to kind of thinking ourselves in a collective, you know, doesn't align itself with economic interests. So to some degree, that's been kind of eroded away. You might say, look, that's another video altogether, another YouTube channel altogether. But in terms of our relationship with trauma, that culture we live in does affect how we see ourselves and how things are framed. And when you look at humility, and I look at that culture, yeah, it's an interesting question to ask. Where does humility fit into consumerism and individualism? And it just doesn't really. It just can't. I mean, it can be a throwaway thing. People can say, oh, Ralph Nadel's a very humble superstar. But he's still a superstar. I mean, just the nature of that reality doesn't take away the fact that he may be kind of gracious about it. And if I was to say to you, like, this person's really humble, then the very act of kind of interviewing him and propping him up goes against the very reality of humility. So who are the most 100 humble people in the world? Well, we'll never know, because they aren't interested in being talked to about their humility. Humble people don't talk about how humble they are. So the very nature of how our communications are set up and our media is set up is to magnify or to put people up on pedestals and stages. The very nature of humility sort of doesn't allow that. So there isn't really a place for humility other than a kind of a token cliche thing that, you know, we should all, you know, be a little bit humble, but not really. I have 2 teenage daughters, and I look at the words written on the t-shirts that are bought for them, and they're generally positive, affirming statements. Go girl, girl power, you got this, you're special, you're magical, love more, be kind. You know, this kind of, I don't know, I don't like it. They do, so they wear it. But what you won't see is a range on humility. You won't see, go girl, but yeah, one day you'll be dead. Or, hey boy, just remember you're no bigger than a worm. You know, you're not so great. You're not very special. You're like everyone else. I mean, I don't see that becoming a range of t-shirts. I mean, maybe I'll set my own merch up and maybe they will. I don't know. But I don't see many parents wanting to get their 12-year-old daughter a t-shirt that says, I'm not that special. Even though it's true. Kids aren't special. Kids just are as they are. So I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that we're in a culture now that doesn't really value humility other than in a token sense. And I think that does affect how we view our trauma, because that is a culture that our trauma exists within. And when I look at the field of healing childhood trauma, healing CPTSD, and I look at all the books I've read and all the literature I've read, there's very little on humility. You know, there's very little on why humility is important and what it matters. Now, I can't say the same for AA and the 12-step programs, because, you know, the first 3 steps, you know, fundamentally start off with an act of humility. But when it comes to healing childhood trauma literature, yeah, it's not mentioned a lot, or I haven't read a lot of it. And I'm not saying it's not there. I just don't really feel like it stands out. Words like self-compassion and self-esteem and self-worth and to be kind and self-love, and I get the reasons for that, but humility isn't really part of that. Now, humility is a tricky word. You know, the nature of what is it to be humble? You know, and to be humbled is to lower oneself, to bring oneself down to ground in relationship to something greater than oneself. That's more or less the general meaning. And the word humility and the word humiliation, you know, basically have the same origin, and they're even connected. Is to be humiliated is to kind of be humbled. And if you've grown up in an environment of adverse childhood experiences, trauma, sexual, emotional, physical abuse, your experience of self is decimated. You are demeaned. You are told that you're nothing, inadvertently or directly. And that's the trauma of feeling like your existence and self and identity is either invisible or is bad or wronged. So the idea of further humiliation or humility in the face of a rebuilding of an identity that's been kind of destroyed or crushed or really hurt and wounded, you can feel like, I don't know if that feels good. You know, like I'm trying to feel good about myself. Why would I want to humble myself? I want to feel better about who I am, not like, oh, I'm just this kind of like little worm in the ground and who am I to kind of say anything. So you can feel this kind of resistance to humility, naturally so, because it's paired with humiliation, debasement, violation, and lack of worth. And I think it's worth reappropriating that word out of that association, because I think we lose something in the process of that. Because there is this, not sequence, but there is an element of healing our childhood trauma. We have to rebuild a solid sense of identity and who we are. And that is a process of rebuilding. And I think in that process, you know, maybe humility there and then isn't sort of the main focus. You know, getting rid of toxic shame, loving ourselves, being kind, being understanding, working on understanding our nervous system, stopping addictions. You know, there are some just basic stuff that you've got to get started on. But there does come a certain point as some of that basic stuff settles, then the virtue of humility and the attribute and the deepening of one's humility, I think, has a really important role to kind of play. Let me share with you why that is and what it has in reality kind of mean for me. And one of the first things would be is the starting point of any healing process starts with humility. You know, you are generally on your knees. I mean, no one or very few people come from a history of sexual abuse, physical abuse or emotional abuse, and at age 18 they start on this healing journey. I mean, some do, and some it's chronic enough where they have to. But for a lot of us in our 30s and 40s, we spend our 20s just getting on with things, just moving forward, just denying, just drinking, just getting away from it all, you know. What happens is eventually things start to collapse. You know, our little world that we built with all this kind of toxic sludge underneath seems to work for a period of time, and then it all starts bubbling up, and you know, just things go to shit basically for many of us. And we're forced to some degree to come to grips with this thing that we thought we could just push aside. We can't. You know, it's too big, and we have to face it. And usually the first point we face that is we are on our knees. And we've been on our knees on and off for a long time, but there's a certain point of surrender, a certain point you say, I can't deny the gravity of this any longer. I need help. And it is a fundamental, deep cry for help where I can't handle myself anymore. I can't handle this life anymore. And I need help. And the act of saying, I need help is an act of humility. It's an act of, I don't have mentally and emotionally and physically the resources, know-how, framing to deal with this thing that's inside me that I just can't seem to kind of keep a lid on anymore. And I need help. I need to understand. I need to learn how to reparent myself. I need to learn how not to feel so terrible about myself. I need to understand why this came about in the first place. And that act of openness is an act most of us only take once we're on our knees, when there is no other choice left, when everything else we've tried to kind of develop just doesn't work. So the beginning of our healing process is an act of humility. And that humility just doesn't end, because there never is, and I've talked about this in other videos, there never is an arbitrary point where it's done. So we keep learning, we keep growing, we keep evolving, we keep staying open with the awareness that, yeah, I need help, I need support. And I still do. I'm still in therapy, I still read books, I still reach out to my friends, I still need help. You know, I am not there, and I never will be. And even if from an acute trauma point of view, some of the help I need isn't as much as it was before, but then I need help with other things, or I need help with this YouTube channel, or I need help with this. That our life is in constant process of asking for help, and that's natural, normal, and healthy. And that is humility, the ability to say, I don't know, and I need support, and I need help. So humility just keeps being part of that journey. So that's one thing where I think humility, supports and helps me, and continues to do so. The second thing that I get from humility is, to me, that bowing down. I think humility comes from the Latin word hubris, or earth, to lower oneself, to ground oneself, and to kind of look up in awe and look up in bewilderment at the world and life we live in, is something that gives my trauma a wider perspective. That when I feel the humility of an awe that comes from looking up at a starry night, or the world we live in, or the trees, or the stars, or the suns, and just feel like how enormous it all is and how magical it is, I feel humbled beneath that or before that. And that humility allows me to see my trauma within a wider, more magnificent context. That all of this is going on in a context that I feel is bigger than just my individual problems, that I'm part of a wider and larger story. And humility is the awareness of that I'm coming back to that I'm not the center of the universe. And that's a good thing, I don't want to be the center of the universe. I want to be part of the universe. I don't want to be the most important thing in the universe. I want to feel connected to the importance of the universe. But it's not contingent on me and protecting me and kind of fostering me and just developing me as a person, but rather it is more the usness and the we-ness rather than the kind of the me-ness. And humility keeps bringing me back to that. And I feel that very strongly. And I think humility also is one of these things that keeps us in a beginner's mindset, to kind of feel like there's a newness to life and that I don't know everything. Actually, I know very little. And each day is this kind of new opportunity to see things I didn't see before, to learn, to be able to apologize, to be able to say, I can do that better, to be able to feel like life isn't new. Because it is a certain weird thing, you get to kind of 46 and you've been there, done that a little bit. There's very few things I read now that I think, well, I've not thought about that before. There's very things I watch on TV and I think, well, that's different. I mean, everything's very repetitive. My day's repetitive. The information I get is repetitive. There is nothing politically that shocks me anymore. There's nothing really. It's like I not know it all, but there's no newness in that. And what humility helps me come back to is, well, that's just a very limited frame, and that sort of sense of there's nothing new is a perspective rather than a reality. And if I'm looking for that newness, if I'm in a position of humility where I'm open to learning new things and new experiences and seeing things differently, then that helps keep a freshness and an openness to what's happening. So they're just a few basic things, but you could go on for a long time about humility, and there's a lot of different kind of aspects of it and expressions of it, from awe to gratitude to openness. Humility has a lot of different kind of facets of the way it kind of operates and the way it functions in a life. But what I do feel is, like, for me in my healing journey, humility, I think, is a word worth bringing into our language and bringing into our experience and journey of healing childhood trauma, that it takes away this need for self-importance. So there's saying, I'm not important, and there's saying, I'm not important. And they're the same sentence, but they're different sentences. Because there's I'm not important in a sense of, I'm this pathetic, miserable, worthless human being that shouldn't exist. There's that I'm not important. And there's I'm not important in the sense of my identity isn't attached to importance or being special or distinct or separate. My identity is connected to something bigger than just this little self that's trying to survive and make do and move here and move left and don't get this and do get that. That there is something grander and more expansive and transcendent that lives through me than that little part of my mind that is trying to control, adapt, and maneuver. And so when I say I'm not important, I'm affirming that importance isn't what it's about. And when I look at really on a fundamental level, if I was to say, look, I'm going to be humble, you have to then ask, what am I being humble to? And if we say, look, at heart, what we're aiming to do, or what I aim to do, is to be in service to that which is greater than myself, or that which is greater than my own kind of pettiness, essentially, then what is that? And to me, it's to be humble ourselves to the love in our hearts. You know, to if there's something we bow down to, it is the love that is in us. And that love that's inside of me, that's in everyone, that is just part of the fundamental fabric of reality, that love I'm willing to bow down to. That love I'm willing to be in service and servitude and to subjugate myself to that love. And when I do that, my importance doesn't matter. It's just irrelevant. I don't need to be special. I don't need to be not special. I just need to be more deeply aligned with that love. So that's my take on humility. I hope that has resonated with you, made sense. If you've got any comments about humility and CPTSD and healing childhood trauma, please put it in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It's been a little bit of a ramble, so excuse me for that. But yeah, I just thought I would, put it out there and see what you think. So look, please take care and all the best. Bye-bye.